May 12, 1945. The kind of night where the jungle seems alive. The air in Burma was thick and wet, every breath heavy with humidity and the smell of soil that had been soaked by weeks of monsoon rain. In a shallow, muddy trench, hacked into the side of a jungle slope, 3 Gurkha riflemen crouched in the dark, listening. They couldn't see much beyond a few meters. The trees formed a solid wall of black, the branches dripping, the undergrowth dense and tangled. But they could hear a snapped twig, a faint rustle, a shift in the pattern of night insects, as something large moved through the undergrowth. It wasn't one man. It wasn't even a patrol. It was a whole group forcing its way forward through the jungle, and it was coming straight at them. One of the men in that trench was Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung, 27 years old, short even by Gurkha standards, gripping a Lee-Enfield rifle that suddenly felt very small compared to the force that was creeping toward them. His position was not just another foxhole on a long line. It was the most forward post of the entire British defensive perimeter in that area. In simple terms, his trench was the door. If the enemy broke through there, they would roll up the flank and hit the rest of the company from the side, turning a defensive line into a trap. Behind him, further up the slope and deeper in the jungle, 2 companies of Gurkhas depended on that forward post doing its job, spotting the attack early, slowing it down, buying precious minutes. The men had prepared as well as they could. They had dug the trench deeper than ordered, piled extra sandbags where they thought the fire would be heaviest, laid out ammunition where it could be grabbed in the dark without looking. Somewhere close by, their section commander, Naik Debesing Bora, watched from a secondary trench a few yards back, trying to read the night. There were no flares, no searchlights, no clear view of an open field, just darkness, trees, and the knowledge that the Imperial Japanese Army preferred to attack at night when confusion was on their side. Then a small change. The background noise of the jungle dipped for a moment, like an audience holding its breath. The sounds of movement grew clearer, soft footfalls, fabric brushing against leaves, the faint clink of equipment, men trying to move quietly but unable to completely mask the presence of at least 200 bodies pushing through thick vegetation. The Gurkhas, in the forward trench, didn't need exact numbers. They knew one thing: there were many more of them than us. At 1:20 in the morning, the first clear sign arrived, not as a shout or a gunshot, but as a small, dark shape arcing through the night. A grenade. It passed over the lip of the trench and landed just outside, close enough to be deadly if it stayed there. In that half-second where most people would freeze, Gurung reacted. He reached up, grabbed it, and threw it back the way it had come. A heartbeat later, the jungle exploded in a flash of light and a sharp, cracking blast. For an instant, the world was carved out in stark white and black. In that single flash, he saw what they were facing: lines of figures in helmets and uniforms, pushing forward through the undergrowth, rifles in their hands, bayonets fixed, more grenades ready. Dozens of them, maybe more than that, and they were already much too close. The light vanished, and the jungle snapped back to darkness. But there was no time to think about what he had just seen. A second grenade came in, this time dropping straight into the trench. In that confined space, there was nowhere to run. Again, Gurung reacted on instinct. He snatched it up and hurled it out. The explosion went off in mid-air, casting another brief, violent snapshot of the attackers. Closer now, shouting, firing, starting to rush. The third grenade followed almost immediately, but this one was different. It dropped right at his feet. In that moment, he did exactly what he had done before: bent down, grabbed it, and tried to throw it back. There was no time. The grenade detonated while it was still in his hand. The blast was brutal at that range. The force tore away the fingers of his right hand and shattered what remained of the palm. Metal fragments sliced into his face, destroying his right eye and drove into his chest, arm and legs. Flames and hot metal scorched his skin. The shock wave threw him backwards into the mud and splinters of wood and earth. The other two Gurkhas in the trench were hit by the same explosion, knocked down, dazed and badly wounded. For a few moments, all three men were out of action, and in front of them, the enemy charge was still coming. In theory, that should have been the end of this forward post. 3 defenders wounded by one blast, at least 200 attackers almost on top of them, grenades still flying, rifles starting to bark through the trees. Under normal circumstances, a position like that would be overrun in seconds. A wounded soldier would be expected to withdraw, if he could, or lie still and hope the medics reached him later. No one would have blamed Gurung for staying down. His right hand was now a ruined stump. Blood was pouring from his face. He could see only with his left eye, and even that eye was full of dirt, sweat, and blood. His whole body was wringing from the explosion, but the Japanese assault didn't pause to let him think. More grenades began to burst around the trench. Bullets snapped through leaves and slapped into the earth. Shadows moved in front of him, closing the distance. Somewhere behind him, the rest of his company was still in their positions, trusting that the forward post would do what it was meant to do for as long as possible. If this trench went silent, the enemy would be free to surge straight into the weak point of the line. Instead of dragging himself to the rear or collapsing completely, Gurung made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Half blind with his right hand destroyed, he reached for his Lee Enfield rifle with his left hand. The weapon had been designed for a right-handed shooter. Right hand on the bolt, left on the stock, right eye behind the sights. He no longer had that option, so he adapted on the spot. He braced the rifle against his left side, used his left hand to work the bolt, and lined up the iron sights with the single eye he had left. There was no time for careful experiments or practice. In front of him, the enemy were almost at the wire. He could hear them shouting, could feel the pressure of their advance. More than see it, he tightened his grip, took aim as best he could, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked into his shoulder. The muzzle flash lit up the trench for an instant, and somewhere out there, one of the attacking soldiers went down. Gurung worked the bolt with the same wounded, blood-slick hand, chambered another round, and fired again. From his position slightly behind, Naik Bora watched in disbelief as that forward trench, which should have been finished in the first minute of the assault, came back to life. Instead of silence or a few desperate shots, he heard a steady, controlled pattern of fire from a single rifle. He knew the men in that trench had been hit. He had seen the grenade go off. Yet now, shot after shot was coming from that same position, holding back a force that should have swept over it like a tide. In the dark jungle, with the ground shaking from explosions and the air full of shouting and gunfire, one badly wounded rifleman had taken it on himself to hold the line. The night that should have ended with his position crushed and his company exposed instead turned into something else, the beginning of a 4-hour stand that no one on either side would ever forget. Long before that night in Burma, Lachhiman Gurung was just a small, wiry kid from a mountain village in western Nepal. He was born in December 1917 in Dakhani, a place where the houses clung to steep hillsides and families survived on tiny patches of farmland. His father grew what he could, usually not enough, and everyone worked from the moment they could stand. There were no real opportunities, no schools with long futures attached. The boy grew up expecting a life spent behind a plow or carrying loads along mountain trails. But in Nepal, there was one escape from that fate: the British Indian Army. For over a century, the Gurkhas had served under the British Crown, earning a reputation that traveled far beyond the Himalayas. In the villages, their stories were told almost like legends. Men from poor families, who returned in crisp uniforms, with steady pay, medals pinned to their chests, and respect wherever they walked. Boys listened to tales of earlier Gurkha heroes who had fought in Afghanistan, France, and the frontiers of India, and something inside them stirred. Lachhiman was one of those boys. Even as a child, he heard again and again that a Gurkha was expected to be fearless, disciplined, and loyal to the last breath. Every man carried a kukri, the curved knife that had become a symbol of their identity. But there was also a practical problem. The army required a minimum height, and Lachhiman fell just short, literally a single inch. By 1940, that inch no longer mattered. The world was burning. Britain was fighting for survival in Europe. Japan was expanding across Asia. And the army needed recruits fast. So when Lachhiman walked to the recruitment post that winter, some say, after bumping into a friend who was headed there himself, the officers looked him over, measured him, and made an exception. At 23 years old, he traded village life for a uniform and a rifle. In the months that followed, he learned the basics of soldiering, how to handle the Lee Enfield, how to march through heat and rain, how to fight in forests so thick you could barely see the man ahead of you. More importantly, he absorbed the Gurkha code. Stand fast, don't yield ground unless ordered. And never, under any circumstances, let fear decide for you. He couldn't know it at the time, but everything he learned in those first months would matter on one specific night in the Burmese jungle, when he would have only one eye, one hand, and a single trench between his comrades and disaster. By the time Lachhiman completed his training, the war had grown far beyond anything most soldiers had imagined. Europe was already largely under German control. North Africa was a battleground of shifting fronts. And across the Pacific, Japan was pushing deep into Southeast Asia with alarming speed. Every few weeks brought news of another city lost, another army forced back, another line broken. The British Indian Army, responsible for defending enormous stretches of territory, suddenly needed tens of thousands of new troops just to keep pace with events. For Gurung and the men who trained beside him, there was no gradual adjustment to this new world. One moment, they were practicing drill under the Nepalese sun. The next, they were being prepared for deployment to one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, the Burmese jungle. Burma wasn't a front defined by sweeping tank battles or open landscapes. It was a place where the terrain itself felt like an enemy. The jungle swallowed roads, pulled at boots, hid snipers in branches, and disease in every mosquito. Visibility was measured in meters, not miles. Even veteran soldiers struggled to keep their bearings. But the most dangerous opponent wasn't the jungle. It was the Imperial Japanese Army. Their soldiers had taken Singapore, Malaya, and Burma in rapid succession. They fought with total commitment, often refusing to retreat even when outnumbered or surrounded. Their night attacks were fierce, fast, and coordinated, designed to overwhelm positions before defenders fully understood what was happening. Allied troops learned quickly that the key to survival lay in discipline, awareness, and the ability to respond instantly under pressure. When Gurung's battalion, the 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles, was eventually assigned to the Burma Campaign, the men knew what they were heading into. Yet Gurkhas had a long history of fighting in harsh terrain, and their commanders trusted them more than most units to hold ground, no matter the conditions. Lachhiman was now part of a regiment known for its stubbornness under fire, its precision with the rifle, and its willingness to stand fast in places where other troops might falter. By 1944, the Japanese advance had slowed, and Allied forces were beginning the long, grueling counteroffensive to reclaim Burma. It wasn't glamorous work. It meant pushing through rivers and swamps, hacking through vegetation, and fighting an enemy who knew the land and used it to their advantage. Every meter of ground was earned with sweat, exhaustion, and casualties. For Gurung, this was his introduction to real war. Not a single dramatic moment, but a steady buildup of marches, ambushes, sudden firefights, and nights spent listening to distant movement in the trees. The army had chosen him despite his height. Now the war would test whether that choice had been right. No one in his battalion knew it yet, but within a year, Lachhiman Gurung would find himself at the center of one of the most remarkable defensive stands of the entire Burma campaign. A moment when the chaos and brutality of the war would narrow to a single trench, a single rifle, and a single man who refused to move. By early 1944, Lachhiman Gurung and his battalion were fully committed to the Burma Campaign, a front unlike any other in the war. Instead of tanks and open fields, they moved through a maze of vegetation so dense it swallowed sound and light. The air clung to their skin, heavy with moisture, and every march felt twice as long as the distance on the map. Rain came suddenly and violently, turning paths into streams and turning uniforms into soaked, clinging weights. The Japanese advance had finally stalled, but that didn't make the fighting easier. The men who had swept across Southeast Asia now dug themselves into hillsides, riverbanks, and ridges, ready to defend every scrap of ground. They were experienced, tough, and more than willing to launch sudden counterattacks. A single day could shift from quiet to chaos in seconds. A rustle of leaves might be a deer, or a squad of soldiers crawling closer for a night assault. Gurung quickly learned what older Gurkhas already knew. In Burma, the jungle made every fight personal. There were no wide vistas, no distant artillery duels. Most encounters happened at close range, so close you could smell the mud on an enemy's boots before you saw him. Communication was difficult, visibility was poor, and movement was slow. A unit could be only 100 meters away and feel completely isolated. But the Gurkhas adapted. They knew how to move silently, how to fight with speed in tight terrain, and how to remain alert even after days in the rain. Their reputation for handling jungle warfare wasn't an exaggeration. They excelled in the exact kind of combat Burma demanded. For Lachhiman, this meant long patrols through terrain, where every step could hide a mine, and every fallen tree could shield a sniper. It meant nights spent listening for danger, and days spent climbing steep hills that felt endless. By 1945, the momentum of the campaign had shifted. Allied forces were pushing south, forcing Japanese units to fall back toward Rangoon. But retreating soldiers can be more dangerous than advancing ones. The Japanese still fought with determination, especially when trapped or cut off. Many of them were running low on supplies, desperate to break through any weak point in the British line that offered a chance of escape. This was the situation when Gurung's battalion received orders to block likely withdrawal routes near the village of Tongdara. The terrain there was rough even by Burmese standards. Tight trails, steep slopes, and jungle thick enough to hide entire companies. For the strategy to work, every defensive position had to hold. There could be no gaps, no hesitation, no points where the enemy could slip through. It was here in these conditions that Gurung and his fellow Gurkha dug in. They carved trenches into muddy hillsides, fortified them with sandbags and roots, and prepared for a fight they knew might come at night. Everyone understood that the Japanese would not attempt a polite probe. If they attacked, it would be with full force and without warning. For many soldiers, the tension before an expected assault is worse than the assault itself. Gurung could feel it every time the jungle fell unusually quiet, every time a distant crack of a branch echoed just a little too sharply. He and his section didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They knew their job. Hold the forward line, alert the rest of the company, and buy as much time as possible. None of them knew that their position, just a shallow trench on a slope in the middle of the jungle, would soon become the center of a battle so violent and so uneven that it would be remembered long after the war ended. And at the heart of it would be a man whose height had once been seen as a disadvantage, but whose resolve would prove stronger than anything the enemy could throw at him. On May 9, 1945, orders reached the 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles, blocked the escape routes of Japanese units, retreating through the jungle near the village of Tongdara. It sounded simple on paper. Hold the ground and prevent any breakthrough. But the terrain made it anything but simple. The monsoon season had already started, turning every slope into a slick sheet of mud, and every trail into a narrow, treacherous channel, bordered by thick, tangled growth. When C Company moved into position, it became clear that the defense would depend on a handful of key points. Small trenches dug into the hillside that overlooked the narrow approaches through the jungle. Among these was one trench pushed farther forward than the rest, placed there to give an early warning and slow an assault long enough for the main line to react. This was the position assigned to Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung and two other Gurkha. Their trench was barely more than a shoulder-deep cut in the earth, reinforced with sandbags and roots they pulled from the surrounding brush. The view was almost non-existent. The jungle ahead was a dense wall that hid anything more than a few meters away. All they could do was listen. Drops of rain on leaves, the buzzing of insects, an occasional shift of branches when a bird took flight. Every sound carried meaning. Every silence carried even more. Setting up a forward post meant accepting the risk without complaint. Everyone knew that if an attack came, the men in that trench would be the first targeted and the last to be rescued. Reinforcements couldn't easily reach them. Retreating wasn't really possible. They were expected to fight until they were overrun, to buy time with their lives if necessary. Gurung and his two comrades worked methodically. They cleared firing lanes as best they could, knowing the jungle would still swallow most of their field of view. They stacked ammunition within easy reach, placing clips and loose rounds where they could be grabbed blindly in the dark. Gurung placed his kukri on the parapet of the trench within arm's reach, a reminder of what could happen if the enemy came close enough for hand-to-hand combat. From the rear trench, their section commander, Naik Debesing Bora, kept watch. He trusted the men in that forward position. Gurung, despite his size, had proven himself reliable, steady and clear-headed, even in sudden bursts of danger. He didn't rattle easily. That mattered, especially at night, when the Japanese were known to move silently through the trees and launch sudden attacks designed to overwhelm a position before the defenders could fully respond. By the evening of May 12th, tension hung over the hillside like a physical weight. The jungle felt unusually still. Even the insects seemed to quiet down at times. The sky darkened quickly, and with it came the realization that if the Japanese were going to strike, they would do it soon. Gurung and the others tightened straps, checked rifles by touch, and made final adjustments to their small trench. The three men sat in silence, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. They had no way of knowing how many enemy soldiers were out there, or how close they already were, but they understood the importance of where they sat. This single patch of mud and sandbags was the key point of the entire company's defense. If it failed, the line could unravel. If it held even briefly, it could buy precious time. And somewhere out in the vast black curtain of trees, more than 200 Japanese soldiers were already moving in their direction, drawn toward the one trench positioned deep enough to make all the difference. Shortly after 1 in the morning on May 13th, the night finally broke, but not with gunfire. It began with a faint mechanical thunk, the distinctive sound of a thrown grenade cutting through the air. From the rear trench, Naik Debesing Bora saw a small dark shape arc over the jungle's edge and drop near the forward post, in a place so quiet you could hear your own breathing. That single object felt like the start of something enormous. Before anyone had time to shout a warning, Gurung reacted. He reached out, grabbed the grenade and hurled it back into the darkness. A second later, the jungle lit up with a flash that revealed what had been invisible. Seconds earlier, dozens of Japanese soldiers charging through the undergrowth, rifles raised, bayonets fixed, grenades already in their hands. The light vanished, and the forest sank back into pitch-black silence, broken almost instantly by the sound of another grenade clattering into the forward trench. It landed right at Gurung's feet. The space they fought in was barely large enough for 3 men to crouch. There was no room to dive, no room to hide. Without thinking, he snatched it up and threw it out again. The explosion snapped through the trees, and for a moment the jungle flickered like a dying candle. The attackers were closer now, far closer than anyone wanted them to be. Then came the third grenade. It didn't bounce off a wall or land outside. It dropped directly into the center of the trench. Gurung bent down, grabbed it the same way he had twice before, and this time the explosion came too fast. The blast tore apart the fingers of his right hand, shattered the bones in his palm, and sent fragments of metal slicing into his face. One shard ripped through his right eye, others hit his chest, arm and legs. Fire scorched his skin. The shock wave slammed him backwards against the mud, and the world around him vanished behind a blur of pain, ringing and darkness. The other two Gurkhas were thrown down as well, badly wounded, half stunned. For several seconds, the forward trench was silent, and out in the jungle, the attack didn't stop. More grenades flew, more shadows moved. 200 men were bearing down on 3, who could barely stand. Under any normal circumstance, that would have been the end of the post. No one would have questioned it. A soldier, with one ruined hand and one working eye, bleeding heavily and surrounded by explosions, would usually be pulled back or left to be found later by medics, if the position wasn't already overrun. But Gurung didn't stay down. He couldn't see clearly. His ears were ringing. His right hand was destroyed. Yet he understood exactly what was happening. The forward post was seconds from collapsing, and if it did, the rest of the line would be hit from the flank. The Japanese weren't probing. They were coming to break through. Gurung's instincts took over. He rolled onto his side, reached for his Lee Enfield with his left hand, and dragged it into firing position. The rifle wasn't built for a left-handed shooter, and certainly not for someone operating the bolt with a single functioning hand. But the alternative, allowing the attackers to pour through, was worse than any pain he felt. He braced the rifle against his left hip, angled it as best he could with his remaining eye, and fired. The muzzle flash lit up the trench, followed by the recoil slamming into his shoulder. He worked the bolt with his left hand, slow, awkward, painful, and fired again. Another flash, another shot into the dark figures closing from the rear trench. Bora couldn't believe what he was hearing. The explosions had stopped. The shouting had grown louder. And yet from the forward post came a steady pattern of rifle fire. Single shots, controlled, relentless. A rhythm that didn't sound like panic. It sounded like someone fighting with purpose. The Japanese had expected a silent, shattered position. Instead, they ran into a wall of bullets from an almost blind man using a rifle he was never meant to fire. One-handed. Their surge hesitated. That hesitation bought more seconds. Gurung shot again, and another attacker fell, the line held by the slimmest margin imaginable. In the pitch-dark jungle, bleeding and burned, half-blind and fighting alone, Lachhiman Gurung made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He had lost his hand, his sight in one eye, and much of his strength, but not the one thing the Japanese assault needed him to surrender: the will to keep shooting. The enemy pushed forward. Gurung pulled the bolt back again. The night's true battle had just begun. The first few minutes after the third grenade should have been the end of the forward post. Instead, that was where the real fight began. The Japanese soldiers expected to sweep straight over the trench, stepping past wounded defenders who could barely lift their heads. Instead, they ran into a stream of precise rifle fire, coming from a man who, by every rule of combat, should not have been able to fight at all. Gurung braced the Lee Enfield awkwardly against his left side and worked the bolt with the same hand, each movement rough and slow compared to a trained two-handed motion. Even so, the shots he fired were controlled and surprisingly accurate. The darkness hid the attackers, but their movement, their shouting, and the brief flickers of muzzle flashes gave him just enough to aim at. The jungle turned into a black tunnel where every sound mattered: footsteps in mud, a snapped branch, the sharp metallic click of a rifle bolt being cycled somewhere out front. The wounded men beside him tried to move, but they were too badly hurt to stand or shoot. They could only lie there, stunned, while Gurung shouldered the entire defense himself. Each shot he fired carried weight. If he missed, the attackers would close in another meter, and once they reached the trench, Nothing would stop them. He could feel blood running down his arm, soaking into his sleeve. His right hand no longer responded at all, just a dead weight attached to his arm. His right eye was gone, his vision blurred from pain and sweat, but he refused to blink longer than necessary. Every fraction of a second counted. From the rear trench, Naik Bora watched in disbelief. He tried sending men forward to reinforce the position. The Japanese fire pinned them down long before they reached even halfway. The jungle around the forward post erupted with gunfire, grenades, and shouted commands in Japanese. But beneath all that noise, there was always the same steady pattern of single rifle shots coming from Gurung's trench. Bora later said that it was the sound that convinced him the position was still holding. One rifle firing as if it belonged to a man who had no intention of stopping. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the Japanese attack shifted. At first they came head-on. When that failed, they tried flanking. But the jungle forced them into narrow paths, and every approach led into Gurung's line of fire. The bodies of fallen attackers began to pile up in front of the trench, forming a grim, uneven barrier that slowed the next wave. Each time the enemy tried to rush, they stumbled over their own dead or had to squeeze past wounded men crawling back toward the shadows. Gurung's ammunition was dwindling. He had started with the standard load, 50 rounds in pouches and 10 in the rifle. But that vanished quickly in a fight like this. Reloading one-handed in pitch darkness was slow and clumsy. He fumbled cartridges, dropped some into the mud, jammed others in too slowly, but every time the rifle clicked empty, he forced himself to reload again. He didn't count the rounds. He didn't think about how many he had left. He just kept loading, firing, cycling the bolt, and firing again. Pain became a background sensation, something he noticed only when a grenade exploded close enough to shower the trench with hot fragments, or when he had to shift his body to reach another pouch of ammunition. His clothes were torn, soaked with mud and blood. His breathing grew shallow as blood loss took its toll. But he stayed upright because there was no other choice. The Japanese weren't retreating. If he fell, the trench fell with him. Around 3 in the morning, the attack surged again. This time it felt different. More coordinated, more determined. Officers shouting orders, grenades thrown in clusters, machine gun bursts stitching across the jungle floor. It was their attempt to finish the job before exhaustion or confusion could slow them down. But every time the wave built momentum, Gurung's rifle cut it down. His shots came slower now, but still steady, still deliberate, still deadly. The hours dragged on. The jungle flashed with explosions every few minutes, and then fell back into darkness, broken only by the crack of Gurung's rifle. The Japanese soldiers couldn't understand why the trench hadn't collapsed. They had thrown everything at it: grenades, rifle fire, close assaults, but that one rifleman kept shooting back. Each time they got close enough to see the shape of the trench, another shot rang out, and another man fell. By the 4th hour, the attackers began to hesitate. Some tried to crawl sideways through the brush, but Gurung shifted his aim and dropped them too. Others tried to gather for one last push, only to be hit before they could even rise to their feet. The psychological impact was enormous. An entire force, trained, well-armed, desperate to break through, was being held in place by a single wounded soldier. Eventually, the attack faltered. The shouting grew softer, the movement slowed. The grenades stopped coming. Dawn was spreading through the jungle canopy, bringing with it a pale, ghostly light. And as the silhouettes of the trees took shape, the Japanese realized that staying meant death from above. When Allied aircraft took to the skies, one final burst of fire, a few final shouts, and then silence. They melted back into the jungle, leaving their dead behind. In the forward trench, Gurung lowered his rifle. He didn't know the Japanese had retreated. He didn't know he had held them off for 4 hours. He only knew one thing. If they came again, he had a kukri waiting beside him. He stayed like that, barely conscious, watching the tree line with his one good eye, ready to fight again. When his comrades finally reached him at dawn, they expected a corpse. Instead, they found Lachhiman Gurung sitting upright in the mud, covered in blood, his ruined hand bandaged in rags, his rifle resting across his lap, and 31 enemy bodies lying just a few meters in front of him. The stand was over, but its legend had only just begun. At dawn, the jungle finally fell silent. When Naik Dabasing Bora led a group of Gurkhas toward the forward trench, he expected to find it overrun. Instead, they found Lachhiman Gurung, still alive, severely wounded, covered in blood and mud, his right hand destroyed, one eye sealed shut. Yet his left hand still gripped his Lee Enfield, pointed toward the jungle, as if he were waiting for the next attack. His kukri lay exactly where he had placed it before the battle. Just beyond the trench lay 31 dead Japanese soldiers, all clustered in front of his firing line. The ground was torn by explosions, littered with weapons and blood trails, showing even more casualties, dragged away. It was clear Gurung had fought alone for hours and stopped an assault that should have broken an entire company. Even drifting in and out of consciousness, he tried to raise his rifle when a twig snapped, proof he had never mentally surrendered. As stretcher bearers carried him to the field hospital, the men stared in disbelief. They knew they had just witnessed the making of a regimental legend, one man holding a position no one should have been able to hold. When Lachhiman Gurung arrived at the field hospital, doctors were amazed. He was still alive. His right hand had to be amputated. His right eye was gone, and his body was full of burns and shrapnel. Yet he clung to life with a steady pulse. As surgeons worked to save him, reports of his stand spread quickly up the chain of command. Naik Dabasing Bora's account, confirmed by the battlefield itself, left no doubt Gurung had held his trench alone for 4 hours, killing 31 attackers and preventing a major breakthrough. The nomination for the Victoria Cross moved swiftly. His bravery fit the medal's purpose exactly. Soldiers across the region spoke of him with awe. His VC citation was published on August 9, 1945, summarizing his actions, though no formal document could truly capture the night he endured. While newspapers celebrated him, he quietly recovered in hospitals, learning to live with one hand and one eye. When asked about the fight, he simply said, "I did my duty." After the war, Japanese survivors confirmed how fierce the defense had felt. They believed an entire unit was firing, not a single wounded man. Returning to Nepal, Gurung was welcomed as a hero, though he never described himself that way. Life was difficult. He struggled financially and physically, but his reputation only grew. Over time, he became a symbol of the Gurkha spirit, loyalty, courage, endurance. His 4-hour stand became part of military lore and Gurkha identity. The Victoria Cross recognized his bravery, but his true legacy was defining what the world believed a Gurkha could be, through action, not words. After the war, Lachhiman Gurung returned to Nepal carrying permanent wounds. One hand gone, one eye blind, his body marked by the battle. Life in his village was hard. Farming with one hand required constant improvisation, and his modest pension barely supported his family. Yet he never complained. He lived quietly, working as best he could, and raising his children with the same determination that had kept him alive in Burma. Over time, Gurung became a respected figure throughout the region. Villagers, veterans, and students saw him as a symbol of courage and loyalty. His story spread far beyond Nepal. In 1995, he traveled to London for Victoria Cross commemorations, where he met historians and fellow VC holders. When asked how he had held his trench alone, he always gave the same simple reply: "I was a Gurkha. I had my duty." Later in life, he became an advocate for better treatment of Gurkha veterans, speaking with quiet authority, born from his own sacrifice. He lived to see improvements in their rights and support. In his final years, he remained humble, polite, and deeply respected, never glorifying his battle or seeking special status. Lachhiman Gurung died on December 12, 2010, at age 92. His death was mourned across Nepal, India, and Brit. Though the jungle battlefield where he fought has long since disappeared, his story lives on, in museums, in military studies, and in the training of every new Gurkha recruit. 31 enemies killed, 4 hours alone, 1 rifle, 1 eye, 1 hand, and a refusal to give up. Gurung never called himself a hero, but his actions embodied the Gurkha creed. Better to die than be a coward. His legacy endures, untouched by time or distance.